I think that's right.
That actually moves into our next story, right? Because we had a ruling on Biden's ghost gun ban, right?
Yep, we sure did. So the same judge, the same federal district judge, Reed O'Connor, that's been previously handing out sort of piecemeal rulings against specific manufacturers, basically blocking Biden's rule, officially vacated the rule. And you wrote a big piece about how he essentially said that the rule is null and void. So that's obviously a huge deal and a big blow to President Joe Biden's agenda. That's one of his primary executive orders on guns that he enacted. Yeah,
it's absolutely a major development in the courts on this front. And I think it's something that also casts a further shadow over the pistol brace ban as it's being scrutinized in the Fifth Circuit right now as well. So you had the bump stock ban was tossed. That was a Trump era ban, but the Biden administration has been defending it in court and has kind of used it as their template for these other executive actions. And now you've had the ghost gun ban tossed as well. And I would expect that the pistol brace ban is going to be next because these are all sort of based on the same essential logic, and the rulings against them are probably going to be based on the exact same legal theories, right? That basically the ATF just doesn't have the power to do this stuff, that they went beyond what's allowed by the Administrative Procedures Act, and also that they have been inconsistent over the years on how these devices should all be regulated. Which also brings into play the rule of lenity, because if the government can't figure out whether or not something is a crime, then basically you can't expect citizens to either.
That's right. Yeah. And that brings us to another big story. We have a study out of Rutgers University that sort of lent academic credence to something that's long been thought to be common knowledge in the gun world, where we now have empirical evidence, at least, that many gun owners, at least a sizable percentage of them, don't feel comfortable divulging their gun ownership to researchers, pollsters, et cetera. So that's a big deal to have that actually show up in empirical research.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. It's a really significant effect, too, if you look at their numbers. Basically, the way they calculated this, because obviously, like how do you figure out that someone's not telling you that they're a gun owner, that they're basically lying to you about it? And to be completely fair, you're not going to come up with a perfectly reliable way to do that. So people should take all of this with a grain of salt. But basically, they put together a profile of what they think a gun owner would look like based on things like where they live, whether it's rural, urban, suburban, the race of the person, the sex, and then a bunch of psychological factors like their tolerance for uncertainty. So how obviously people don't like uncertainty generally, but there does seem to be apparently in research a disconnect between your non-gun owner and your gun owner, which makes sense if you think about it, right? People who own guns tend to want to be prepared for anything, basically. That's one of the reasons you might own a gun, for sort of self-protection, obviously. So they took these factors that they determined would show that somebody is probably a gun owner, and they put those against the people who said they don't own guns. And they found that of people who matched 50% of the indicators that they picked out for gun owners, that like 45% of people who said no meet that criteria, which means that potentially almost half of the people who said they don't own a gun do own a gun. Or at the very least, what they're really saying is that they fit the profile of somebody who would own a gun. And so they actually thought that was kind of a remarkable finding, that the number sounded too high to them. And so they also did a more conservative sort of gate, which was a 75%. If the person hit 75% of the indicators that they picked out for gun owners, then they'd count them as somebody who's probably not being forthcoming about owning a gun. And they still found a significant effect. It was still like 10%, which would move, their overall finding in the initial poll was that 34% of people self-identified as gun owners, which is pretty well in line with what you see from Gallup and Pew and Associated Press and these other major pollsters. And even with that higher threshold, the more conservative estimate, that bumps the number all the way up to 40%. So pretty remarkable study right there, I think, because it does go to this point that a lot of gun owners and gun rights advocates have made for years, which is that people are probably underreporting whether they own guns or not. They just don't share that information with researchers or pollsters.
And we've kind of seen that reflected in the polls, right? They've been relatively static over the last few years when they ask, how many Americans own a gun or have a gun in their home. When, we've covered, there's been a pretty, at least during the pandemic, a sizable uptick in first-time gun owners that were, picked up in various studies and various polls. And yet that number didn't change. And that sort of explains perhaps why that number's been flat over time, because there's just X% of gun owners just don't tell people that they own guns.
I mean, the number's gone up a little bit, especially if you broaden it out to people who report having a gun in the home rather than, because that number is higher, to be fair. Like that's traditionally you get around a quarter will say that they own a gun themselves, but somewhere in the low to mid 40s will say that there's a gun in their home. And I do think that part of that probably explains this disconnect, because one of the things that they used as an explanation for why this is happening, or put forward as a potential explanation, was that, some people might be married to someone who's a gun owner. And so they'll match a lot of the same identifiers as what a gun owner would be, because they probably have a gun in the home, but they don't consider it their gun, right? And so that's where you might get some of the disconnect. That adds, so that, because the final number, right, that I just described, at least in the more conservative approach, is closer to that gun in the home number that you see from a lot of these pollsters. I think the Associated Press had it up to 46% in their most recent poll. And that has shown more of a trend up than the personal gun ownership. But, there's a lot of reasons that they put forward for why people might not be willing to identify themselves as gun owners in these kinds of polls. And if you use the 50% gate, the looser gate, it popped the number all the way up to like 60%. So, because it was like half of the people who said no actually do own guns under this. Now, the researchers said that probably identifying a lot of people who still don't actually own guns, but just fit the profile of somebody who does. To be fair, like, I don't want to get too far outside of reality with some of these numbers, but it is fascinating. And we interviewed one of the authors of the study, so she was pretty forthcoming talking about this and some of the implications, and especially for researchers themselves, because if you're not capturing how many people actually own guns when you're going to do gun research, you're trying to connect gun ownership with anything really, suicide rate or violence or self-defense or whatever you're trying to study. If you can't get a reliable measure of how many people own firearms in the population you're studying, then your research is much less reliable, right?
Yeah.
So
fascinating implications for sure. Speaking of research, that takes us to our last story. We have some new research on homicide rates, and we actually have some at least early indications that there's some positive news. Homicide rates appear to be on the decline in a pretty substantial fashion. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, you had a good piece on this, and actually even better analysis piece, I think. But the basic story is that there's a really widely cited data analyst named Jeff Asher, who has looked at he's got a data set of the top 100 cities that are publicly releasing their crime data, and he's using that to make predictions about the overall murder rate in the country. And effectively what he's found is that it's dropped significantly, as much as 10% from last year through the first 6 months of 2023. We've seen this huge decline. He said that, if the trend holds, that would be the largest decline in history for murder rate. And it's pretty fascinating because it comes right after we've seen this murder spike. We've been experiencing this really high level of murder in the United States, getting us back towards the sort of very bad days of the 1980s and 90s. And perhaps that's over now, is I guess the indication, right?
That's right. Yeah. And he cautioned, to be fair, he did caution that, as you pointed out, we're only midway through 2023. We don't know if this will hold yet. It's also just a sample of 100 cities, so you can't draw too broad of conclusions based off of just that small sample.
Right.
But
and to be fair, too, we've talked about in the past on the show about the FBI's numbers, and the big problem with them post 2020 was that they have changed their reporting system. They're getting fewer police departments actually reporting numbers to them. They've lost like 5,000 departments, which is really bad, but they do still have I think 11,000 overall. So the FBI's data set, as much as we've criticized that for being incomplete, keep in mind that we're only talking about 100 or so cities and their departments reporting here. So it has the same sort of potential limitations.
That's right. Yeah. The caveats still apply. But that being said, he's obviously capturing something with this. This is police data. This is official data, which, draws broader implications for politics, gun politics. You've seen crime and guns become sort of an issue again in ways that are reminiscent of the 90s when things were, kind of at their height. And, as I kind of dove into in my analysis piece, you have to wonder if murder trend continues to go down and the American people perceive that, could we potentially see the gun issue and the crime issue recede in their minds as well? That's obviously something that could potentially happen, but it also depends on how the American people actually perceive this, if they actually pick up on the fact that the data is moving in this direction.
And as you talk about at length in your analysis piece that people, I think, should go and read for more on this, there's also the issue of what is highly publicized gun violence, which are mass shootings, which are still at a record pace from everything we've seen, regardless of which measure you look at. We've talked on the show, obviously, in the past a lot about the different ways that the different counts that exist out there and their strengths and weaknesses. But regardless of which one you look at, the mass shooting issue is still at really all-time high right now, even as we're seeing perhaps overall murder drop. So how that will play out is another significant factor